The voice stopped that night. MGM Grand Casino, Detroit, Michigan. May 17, 2017. 11:35 p.m. A Wednesday night at the end of a Soundgarden tour. Chris Cornell had just walked off stage after 17 songs, sweat-soaked, exhausted. 52 years old, but still hitting notes that made younger singers weep. The last song he performed was an old spiritual. Not planned, not on the set list. He just started singing it, a cappella, voice raw and haunting in the sudden silence after the final chord. The last line he sang, "Jesus, make up my dying bed." 11,000 people thought it was poetic, powerful, classic Cornell, always dramatic, always intense. The crowd thought the encore was over. They didn't know the concert was too. An hour later, he texted his wife, Vicky, "I love you more than life itself." It was 12:43 a.m., the last message he would ever send. At 1:30 a.m., a bodyguard found him in the bathroom of his MGM Grand hotel room. Christopher John Cornell, the voice that launched grunge, the man who could sing 4 octaves and make grown men cry, the father of 3 who grew roses in his garden and cooked pasta for his kids on Sunday nights, dead. Hanging from an exercise band attached to the bathroom door, still wearing his concert clothes, no note, no explanation, just silence where the most beautiful voice in rock used to be. The medical examiner ruled it suicide within hours. Drugs in his system, Ativan, a sedative, but nothing lethal. Nothing that explained why a man who just performed flawlessly, who had a tour schedule full of dates, who had texted his wife he loved her, would walk into a bathroom and decide he was done. Vicky Cornell didn't believe it. Still doesn't. She pointed to the Ativan, said it can cause impulsive behavior, suicidal ideation. She said her husband wouldn't do this. Not to her, not to their children, not when he'd fought so hard to stay alive for so long. But his bandmates weren't surprised. Not really, because they'd known Chris for 30 years. They'd watched him battle the thing he called the absence. Not depression exactly, but something deeper. The feeling that even when you're surrounded by thousands of screaming fans, you're completely alone. That even when you're singing about hope, you're drowning in despair. That even when you have everything to live for, living itself feels impossible. Was this really suicide? Or did something push him over an edge he'd been standing on his entire life? Could a pill have stolen the control from a man who'd spent decades learning to manage his darkness? Or was May 17th, 2017 just the night when 52 years of fighting finally exhausted him? But to understand how the voice stopped in a Detroit hotel bathroom, we must first understand how it began in Seattle. In a boy who was born, as he would later say, to sing about ghosts. Seattle, Washington. The 1970s. A gray city where rain falls like memory and mountains loom like judges. Chris Cornell was born Christopher John Boyle on July 20th, 1964, to Ed Boyle and Karen Cornell. His parents' marriage was already fracturing. By the time Chris was a teenager, they'd divorced and he took his mother's maiden name. The family wasn't poor, wasn't rich. Ed was a pharmacist. Karen was an accountant. They lived in a house where the rules were clear and the expectations were high, and Chris, the middle child, learned early how to be quiet. Too quiet. At 12, something broke inside him. He couldn't name it then. Wouldn't be able to name it properly until decades later when he finally had the vocabulary for depression, anxiety. The weight that sits on your chest like a boulder and tells you the world would be better off without you. He'd spent his life naming the absence. He stopped going to school, stopped seeing friends, spent entire days in his bedroom with the curtains drawn, listening to the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and wondering why he felt like he was dying when nothing was technically wrong. "I was convinced I was going to die young," he later told a journalist. "Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't imagine feeling this way forever and surviving it." His mother tried therapists, medication, tough love. Nothing worked. Chris retreated further into himself. For nearly 2 years, he barely left his room, a ghost in his own house. A boy learning what it meant to be trapped inside your own mind. What saved him, ironically, tragically, was music. He started playing drums, then guitar, then singing. And when he sang, something happened. The weight lifted, not completely, never completely, but enough that he could breathe, enough that he could imagine a future where he wasn't drowning. The wind howled through Seattle rain. He answered with a drum beat. "The voice is not mine," he would say years later. "It just passes through me." At 16, he emerged from his room, pale, thin, changed, but alive. He started going to shows in Seattle's underground music scene, punk venues, dive bars, places where misfits gathered and volume drowned out thought, and for a few hours, you could forget you wanted to die. He met Kim Thale at a house party. Kim played guitar like he was exorcising demons. They became friends immediately, the way outsiders recognize each other without words. Kim introduced Chris to Hiro Yamamoto, bass player, quiet like Chris, intense like Chris. Probably as damaged as Chris, though they never explicitly said it because Seattle men in the 80s didn't talk about feelings. They played music instead. In 1984, they formed Soundgarden, named after a sculpture in Seattle. 3 guys who couldn't quite fit into the world, building a sound that was too heavy for metal, too melodic for punk, too dark for anything playing on the radio. Chris became the drummer and singer, which should have been impossible. Singing requires breath control, drumming requires constant physical exertion. But Chris did it anyway because nothing about Chris Cornell was supposed to be possible. A voice that could go from whisper to scream in the same breath. Range that made classically trained singers jealous. Power that could fill stadiums. Beauty that could break hearts. All of it coming from a guy who still sometimes couldn't get out of bed because the absence was whispering that none of it mattered. Could that boy locked in his bedroom have guessed that his voice would become legendary? That his darkness would become the soundtrack for a generation? That his inability to feel okay would make millions of people feel less alone? By 1987, Soundgarden was the Seattle sound before there was a Seattle sound. Before Nirvana broke everything open. Before grunge became a marketing term. They were just a band playing too loud in too small venues, building a following of kids who felt like Chris felt, like the world was beautiful and terrible and overwhelming, and the only rational response was to scream. They signed to SST Records, released an EP that got attention from people who mattered. Chris moved from drums to full-time frontman because his voice was too powerful to hide behind a drum kit. They added Matt Cameron on drums, a 4th misfit, a complete band. Their early albums, Ultra Mega OK Louder Than Love, were raw, heavy, dark, songs about depression and isolation and the beauty and decay. Chris writing lyrics that read like suicide notes with metaphors. Critics called them too intense. Fans called them perfect. But Chris was struggling. The success brought pressure, expectations, eyes watching. And Chris Cornell was a man who needed to hide to survive. Stage presence was a performance. The confidence, the sexuality, the power, all of it was a role he played for 90 minutes a night. Backstage, he was still the kid in the dark room, still fighting the weight on his chest. The wind got louder, he sang higher. Then came 1990. The year Seattle music exploded, and the year everything got worse. Andrew Wood was Chris's friend, singer for Mother Love Bone, charismatic, talented, troubled, deep into heroin because that's what you did in Seattle in the late 80s if the pain was too loud and the music wasn't enough to drown it out. March 19, 1990. Andrew overdosed, coma, life support. Chris visited him in the hospital, sat beside a body that was technically alive, but essentially gone. Watched machines breathe for someone who'd forgotten how. March 24th, Andrew died, 24 years old. Another voice stopped. Chris didn't sleep for days, he wrote instead. Poured his grief into songs that would become Temple of the Dog, a tribute album for Andrew featuring members of what would soon become Pearl Jam. Eddie Vedder, who Chris barely knew, sang backup on some tracks. Their voices together, Chris's controlled power and Eddie's raw pain, created something transcendent. The opening track was titled after something Andrew used to say hello to heaven. Chris wrote it in one night, didn't edit, didn't second guess, just let the grief pour out through his voice and into the world. When he sang it, people who'd never met Andrew Wood cried, because Chris Cornell had a gift for making his specific pain universal, for singing about his ghosts in a way that summoned everyone else's. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? Can you separate the art from the agony that created it? The early 90s were supposed to be Soundgarden's victory lap. Grunge exploded. Nirvana's Nevermind changed everything. Pearl Jam's 10 made Eddie Vedder a household name. Alice in Chains brought darkness to MTV. And Soundgarden, the band that started it all, was finally getting recognized. They signed to A&M Records, major label, major budget, major expectations, released Bad Motorfinger in 1991. It went platinum. Songs like Outshined and Rusty Cage became anthems for a generation that didn't believe in anthems. But Chris was uncomfortable with success. Fame, he said, was the loneliest drug. Thousands of people screaming your name and not one of them actually knowing you. Being recognized everywhere but understood nowhere. Having everything you thought you wanted and realizing it doesn't fix the thing that's broken inside you. He started drinking more, self-medicating the anxiety that came with visibility, the depression that came with pressure, the imposter syndrome that told him he didn't deserve any of this because he was just a kid who'd spent 2 years in his bedroom convinced he was going to die. Then came 1994. Super Unknown, the album that made Soundgarden unavoidable, the album with Black Hole Sun. Chris wrote it in 15 minutes. He was in his Seattle apartment, sun streaming through windows, and suddenly had this image of sun being sucked into a black hole, light becoming darkness, beauty becoming void. He wrote it down, barely changed a word, brought it to the band, they recorded it, released it. It became inescapable. MTV played the video constantly, surreal, disturbing, David Lynch-esque imagery of people with distorted faces in a suburban nightmare. The song climbed charts, won Grammys, became the song people who didn't even like grunge knew by heart. But Chris hated it. Not the song itself, he was proud of the song. He hated what it became. The commercialization, the mainstream acceptance. The way alternative stopped meaning alternative when everyone was listening to it. It's not a hit, he told a friend. It's a suicide note with guitars. Behind all that success, was there an unbearable darkness that nobody saw? Or did everyone see it and just mistake it for artistry? The success brought everything Chris feared. Pressure to follow up Super Unknown. Pressure to tour constantly. Pressure to be the voice of a generation when he could barely be the voice of his own sanity. The band was fracturing under the weight of expectations. Arguments about creative direction, about money, about who was drinking too much and who was using too much and who was holding everything together. Chris was all three. Drinking to cope with the pressure, using to cope with the drinking, and somehow still holding the band together through sheer force of voice. Because when he sang, none of the other stuff mattered. When he sang, he was bulletproof. Except he wasn't. In 1997, Soundgarden announced they were breaking up. Officially, it was mutual differences. Unofficially, it was Chris Cornell standing on a stage after a show in Honolulu, looking out at thousands of fans and realizing he couldn't do this anymore. That the thing that had saved him was killing him. That the voice that passed through him was taking pieces of him with it. The final show was February 9th, 1997. They didn't announce it was the final show, just finished the set, walked off stage. And quietly, without drama, one of the most important bands in rock history ceased to exist. Chris went home to Seattle, isolated, depressed, rich and famous and utterly lost. The thing that had kept him alive since he was 16 was gone. And without Soundgarden, who was Chris Cornell? Just a guy with a voice and no reason to use it. Just a man standing in an empty house listening to silence, wondering if this was finally the time the absence won. He started using heroin. Not like Andrew. Chris was too controlled for that, but enough to make the absence quieter, enough to make days pass without noticing. Enough that his friends started worrying and his mother started crying, and even Chris, through the fog, knew he was going to die if he didn't stop. So he stopped, checked into rehab, detoxed, did therapy, took medication. All the things you're supposed to do when you're rich and famous and want to stop wanting to die. And it worked. Mostly. He got clean, stayed clean, met Susan Silver first, married her, had a daughter named Lily, tried to be the father he wished he'd had, tried to be present, tried to be normal. He learned to live beside the absence, like a shadow that never slept. But normal was hard for Chris Cornell. Normal meant silence, and silence meant the absence could speak. Did this tragic period mark his downfall, or was it the darkness he needed to transform? Chris released his first solo album, Euphoria Morning. It was nothing like Soundgarden. Softer, more vulnerable, more openly about pain and recovery and the difficulty of staying alive when your brain keeps telling you to die. Critics loved it. Fans were confused. It didn't sell well. Chris didn't care. He wasn't trying to be a rock star anymore. He was trying to be a person, and for a few years it worked. Then came Audio Slave. 2001. The members of Rage Against the Machine, Tom Morello, Tim Comerford, Brad Wilk, needed a singer after Zach De La Rocha left. Someone with range, power, star power. They called Chris. He almost said no. He was done with bands, done with expectations, done with the pressure that came with being the voice of anything. But Tom Morello was persistent, sent him instrumental tracks, asked him to just try writing to them. See if anything came. Chris wrote lyrics to a track that would become Like a Stone, about waiting to die, about believing you'll see someone again after death, about hope that sounds like acceptance of hopelessness. He sent it back to Tom. Tom called immediately. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. We're a band." Audio Slave was massive. Their first album sold millions. They played arenas. Chris was back on top. And this time, he told himself, this time he'd do it right. This time he wouldn't let the absence win. But the absence doesn't lose. It just waits. Audio Slave lasted 3 albums, 7 years. Then Chris walked away again. Same reasons. Different band. The touring was exhausting. The expectations were crushing. The performance of being Chris Cornell, confident, powerful, in control, was exhausting when the reality was still just a kid in a dark room who couldn't figure out why existing hurt so much. He focused on solo work, on being a husband. He'd divorced Susan, married Vicky Karayanis, had 2 more children. On being a father. On cooking pasta and growing roses and teaching his kids guitar because music saved him and maybe it would save them too if they ever needed saving. He'd hum lullabies instead of singing them. His son once told a friend, "My dad's voice makes the walls feel safe." He seemed better, happier, more at peace. He did acoustic tours, just him and a guitar, no hiding behind volume and distortion. Just the voice. Raw, vulnerable, perfect. In 2010, Soundgarden reunited. Chris, Kim, Matt, Ben Shepherd. Like no time had passed. Like the 13-year break was just an intermission. They released King Animal in 2012, toured, played the old songs and new songs and reminded everyone why they mattered. Chris seemed in control, sober, present. The darkness was still there. It was always there, but he'd learned to live with it, to carry it, to sing through it. Depression isn't sadness, he told an interviewer. It's the absence of everything. You can be surrounded by love and success and still feel nothing, still be completely alone. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Or is managing them the best we can hope for? The 2017 Soundgarden tour should have been a celebration, a victory lap, proof that you can survive your 20s and 30s and all the darkness that comes with youth and still make great music in your 50s. Still matter. Still have something to say. Chris seemed good. He was writing, planning a solo album, talking about future Soundgarden material. excited about music in a way he hadn't been in years. His daughter once asked, "Why do you sing about sad things?" He smiled, "Because they stop being sad when you sing them." But something was wrong. He was taking Ativan for anxiety, a lot of Ativan, more than prescribed. His wife noticed, but Chris dismissed her concerns. He was fine. He'd been managing this his whole life. He knew his limits. Detroit, May 17th, the second to last show of the tour. Everything seemed normal. Soundgarden played 17 songs. Chris's voice was strong, no signs of trouble. He was sweating, breathing hard, normal after 90 minutes of singing at that intensity. In Detroit, the wind finally sang back, but the band noticed something off. Chris forgot lyrics to "The Day I Tried to Live." Not terribly. He improvised, covered. But Chris Cornell didn't forget lyrics. Chris Cornell was precise, professional. Something was different. After the show, Chris complained of not feeling well. Said his body hurt. Said he was exhausted. The band assumed it was just age and touring. They were all tired. They had one more show, then break, then start planning the next phase. Chris went to his hotel room, called Vicky, told her his voice was damaged, that he'd fucked up the show, that nothing felt right. She heard something in his voice, panic maybe, confusion, something not quite Chris. She told him to take an Ativan. It helped before. He took 2. Then he hung up. 15 minutes later, his bodyguard Martin Kirsten did a room check. Protocol, knocked. Chris answered, said he was fine, going to shower, going to bed. Martin left. An hour passed. Vicky called. No answer. Called again. No answer. She called Martin. "Something's wrong, check on him." Martin went back. Knocked. No answer. Used his key, the room was empty, shower running. He checked the bathroom. The door was wedged shut. He forced it open. Chris Cornell was hanging from an exercise band attached to the bathroom door. Still in his concert clothes, face down, blood coming from his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue. Martin cut him down, started CPR, called 911. Paramedics arrived in minutes, worked on him for over an hour. Too late. Chris had been dead for at least 40 minutes. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or did the medication strip away his control? The investigation was quick. No signs of struggle, no evidence of anyone else in the room. Toxicology showed Ativan, caffeine, naloxone, butalbital. Nothing at lethal levels, just enough to explain impaired judgment. Enough that someone who'd spent his whole life learning to control his demons might lose that control for just long enough to make an irreversible decision. The medical examiner ruled it suicide by hanging. Case closed. But Vicky fought the ruling. Said Chris would never. Said the Ativan caused this. That her husband didn't want to die. That he was making plans. That he'd texted her he loved her. That you don't kill yourself an hour after telling your wife you love her more than life itself. Unless you do. Unless more than life itself wasn't hyperbole but literal. Unless loving her more than life meant choosing death so she wouldn't have to watch him suffer anymore. His bandmates released a statement. "We are heartbroken." Eddie Vedder didn't speak publicly for months. Tom Morello wrote, "He had the most beautiful voice in rock and it killed him." Chester Bennington, Linkin Park singer, Chris's close friend, was destroyed. At the funeral, he sang Hallelujah, voice breaking, tears streaming. Looking at Chris's casket and knowing, probably already knowing, that he wouldn't be far behind. Exactly 2 months later, on what would have been Chris's 53rd birthday, Chester Bennington hung himself. Same method, same finality. Like Chris's death gave him permission to stop fighting his own darkness. The music world reeled. 2 voices gone in 10 weeks. 2 men who'd spent their lives singing about pain finally overwhelmed by it. 2 fathers who'd fought so hard to stay alive for their children. Losing to the thing they'd been fighting since childhood. Was Chris Cornell's death as straightforward as reported? Or were there forces more complex than suicide notes and toxicology reports? Not conspiracies, not cover-ups. But the simpler, more horrifying truth that depression is a disease. that decades of managing it doesn't cure it, that medication can help and hurt simultaneously, that even love, even having everything to live for, isn't always enough when your brain chemistry is fighting against you. The wind, invisible, relentless, everywhere at once. Except Chris Cornell's wind was internal. The absence, the weight, the thing he'd been carrying since he was 12 years old. His last words unsaid, but perhaps understood. "I'm tired. I've been fighting for 40 years. I want to rest." What is Chris Cornell's legacy? His voice, obviously. The 4-octave range. The power and beauty that made him the standard every rock singer measured themselves against. The recordings that will outlive everyone reading this. The proof that a kid from Seattle who spent 2 years in his bedroom convinced he'd die young could become one of the greatest singers in rock history. But his legacy is also the conversation he forced. About depression in the music industry. About the cost of fame. About how we lionize suffering artists while doing nothing to help them suffer less. About how many musicians have to die before we admit that tortured genius isn't romantic. It's tragic and preventable. After Chris died, more musicians spoke openly about mental health, about seeking help, about medication and therapy and the daily work of staying alive when your brain tells you not to. His death, like his music, made people feel less alone. Even in dying, Chris Cornell was giving people permission to talk about the things that hurt. Music doesn't kill its singers. It teaches them how to monetize their breakdowns. We mistake endurance for cure. We call surviving recovery and we call exhaustion art. His daughter Toni became a singer. She has his tone, his control, his ability to make beauty from pain. At her first major performance, she said, "My father told me, when you sing, don't sing to please, sing to survive." So that's what I'm doing. Those words are now engraved on Chris's headstone. A reminder that for him, singing wasn't a career. It was survival. The voice that passed through him was the only thing keeping him alive. And when the voice couldn't save him anymore, there was nothing left. What does it mean to be gifted with something that saves you and kills you simultaneously? How do you separate the art from the artist when the art is made from the artist's pain? Can we celebrate Chris Cornell's music without celebrating the suffering that created it? Chris once wrote, "If I ever go, it won't be because I hate life. It'll be because I've seen too much of it." He was 49 when he wrote that, 3 years before he died, already tired, already knowing that eventually the weight wins, that you can be sober and successful and surrounded by love, and still not able to carry the absence anymore. The fashion industry doesn't murder its models, and the music industry doesn't murder its singers. But both teach their people how to disappear beautifully, how to turn pain into profit, how to be valued for their suffering while being given no real tools to survive it. Chris Cornell fought for 40 years, longer than Andrew Wood, longer than Kurt Cobain, longer than Lane Staley, longer than Scott Weiland. He had all the advantages: money, family, resources, decades of therapy and medication. And still, on a Wednesday night in Detroit, the weight was heavier than his reasons to stay. His story is particularly haunting because he did everything right. Got sober, got help, built a family, created art, stayed present, fought the darkness with every tool available. And still, the darkness won. Not because he was weak, but because depression doesn't care about strength. It doesn't care about talent or love or reasons to live. It just waits, patient, relentless, until you're too tired to fight anymore. He only wanted to survive, to use music as the life raft it had been since he was 16, to pass the voice through him and let it carry him to shore. But sometimes the music isn't enough. Sometimes even the most beautiful voice in rock can't sing loudly enough to drown out the absence. The voice stopped on May 18th, 2017. But it echoes in his recordings, in his daughter's performances, in every singer who learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, in every person who heard Chris Cornell sing about darkness and felt less alone in their own. Tom Morello said Chris was born to sing about ghosts. And maybe that's the truest thing anyone ever said about him. He spent his whole life channeling something beyond himself, making the intangible tangible, giving voice to pain that has no words, singing for everyone who couldn't sing for themselves. And now he is the ghost, his voice the thing others channel, his story the reminder that even the strongest among us are still fighting battles invisible to everyone else. The voice ended. The absence didn't. It just changed owners, us. The wind was always stronger than him. But he sang into it anyway. For 40 years he stood in the storm and turned it into art. And when he finally fell, he left behind proof that he existed, that he fought, that he mattered. Detroit, May 17th, 2017. The voice sang one last time, made beauty from exhaustion, gave everything it had left, then stopped. And somewhere, in the silence that followed, maybe Chris Cornell finally found the thing he'd been searching for since he was 12 years old. Not death, but peace. The absence of the absence, the end of the wait, the rest he'd earned but couldn't find while living. He wanted to survive through singing. Instead, he survived through singing and then he stopped. But maybe, just maybe, that's enough. To have fought, to have made beauty, to have been heard. The voice passed through Chris Cornell. And now it passes through us. In every recording, every cover, every time someone hears his music and thinks, someone understands. The voice didn't stop. It transformed, from sound to memory, from one man's pain to everyone's connection. Maybe that's what salvation sounds like. Not silence, but someone else still singing. So here's the question that remains, the one Chris Cornell left us to answer. How many more voices do we need to lose before we stop romanticizing the pain that creates art? And when will we stop applauding pain as proof of authenticity? When will we finally learn that the most dangerous silence isn't the one in empty rooms, but the one in crowded venues where thousands hear the music but nobody hears the cry for help?